Thanks for joining me today. In this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism with Penny Colpin, I'll be talking more about metaphors and analogies that I would find helpful to describe my type of experience. In the first segment, I mentioned that the dominant analogy used is that of these are illnesses like diabetes, hence you need to take something the rest of your life, which isn't true, but that's what's been marketed for decades now. So in this, I mentioned in the first segment that I have like 40 different metaphors and analogies that describe my type of experience better than that of illness. And I actually, while preparing this, realized, oh, I can group some of them together. So in this one, I'm going to be talking about natural but violent type experiences. So back in 2013, in June of 2013, I go up to Canada quite a bit. Over, 25 years, up until the pandemic, I made it up to Banff at least once a year between 2001 and 2020, sometimes twice. In a few years, I even made it up there 3 times. I love Banff, which is kind of interesting considering that's where I had this breakdown, this very traumatizing event. And yet for me, it's like going home. I have so many memories, not just of the pain, but especially of these mystical types experiences. But anyway, in June of 2013, I'd actually been planning on going up camping over Canada Day to get my maple syrup and pancake breakfast. But in June 19th to the 21st, a major storm ended up circling over the Canadian Rockies, just south of Banff, specifically the Kananaskis region. And over 2 days, they got like 8 inches of rain up in the mountains. One of the towns outside, east of the mountains, High River, got about 13 inches over 2 days, which compared to some of the flooding involved maybe in the United States, that those numbers might be less than what is experienced in other areas. Part of the problem is that in June, there's still quite a bit of snowpack up in the mountains, and the ground is mostly frozen, to some degree. So all of that water, instead of any of it really saturating into the ground, most of it just washed right off those mountains and tore out quite a bit of, the trees, the debris in those areas where there wasn't snow. A lot of material ended up coming out of those mountains because of that violence. So that's a pretty decent analogy for what my experience felt like, is just this massive flow of material that some of it was just benign, but some of it was like, what is this? All of this energy that had been pent up and stored. I ended up canceling the trip because basically the town of Canmore, which is about 10 miles southeast of Banff, at one point they had to close the Trans-Canada Highway. As the water moved on through to Calgary, it actually flooded the Saddle Dome, which is right along the river there, up to, I think it was about 10 or 15 seats up in the arena. So there's considerable water there. So it wasn't until later that fall that I ended up making it up there to visit. And one of my favorite areas in that area is called the Kananaskis region. It's a group of provincial parks southeast of Banff. And the first time I drove along there, I was with my mom, and these small creeks that maybe had been, I don't know, 10 feet wide, stuff I hadn't really specifically noticed. We would go driving past and they were like 100 meters wide of just rock exposed. And at first I thought, what is this? An avalanche? And then you realize, oh no, that's all the dirt that's been scoured away. So that was an indication of how much water came down through, or the width of how much water came down through that channel. And for me, talking about it, there's, considerable violence in that, considerable force. So that's why that kind of metaphor or analogy actually works quite well, because it captures just these forces involved that are so indescribable. Yeah, and so of course that took quite a bit of time to recover. It took, all these communities east of the Canadian Rockies, where all the watershed was, 100,000 people were displaced. Um, it took, I think it was $1 billion or more to, recover. So again, from that force, there's recovery involved. There's effort to, in a sense, if you want to consider it, rebuild. Maybe you don't rebuild the same way. Maybe you fortify different structures. But when I think of that scouring of the dirt that showed multiple creeks along this stretch of road that had just been scoured out, 70 meters wide, 100 meters wide. It reminded me of a quote from William Blake, who he was born in the 1750s, died in 1820s, was a social reformer and poet and painter from England. But he had the quote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern." So if you think of stored trauma in the system, I'm thinking of the book by Bessel van der Kolk, a Dutch psychiatrist, The Body Keeps the Score, about how trauma stays stored in our system. This type of process is just a massive, I don't know, cleansing, if you will, a wiping out of, I shouldn't laugh, but a wiping out of all this stored crap in your system. So yeah, that's one of the things that I use as an analogy. This is similar to the Yellowstone floods in June of 2022, which was just 3 years ago. They got 12 inches of rain in 2 days over the park. Again, there was still melting snow involved. And so part of it is when that rain, comes down on the snow, it actually helps break up the snow and helps it move on downstream and melt and that type of thing. I didn't realize, I just looked this up as I was preparing for this, but the Montana National Guard actually had to airlift 87 people out of the park area for with regard to safety. I live about an hour and a half from Yellowstone. And for a few weeks after that, you really couldn't travel through Paradise Valley, or at least you could travel along one of the roads. The other road was mostly closed, only to local people. It washed out a few of the roads in the park in different sections. I know the main entrance from Mammoth up to Gardner, which is in Montana, had 5 sections of this main road in Yellowstone. So that entrance was closed until October, when they had to get a road set up to access some of the Montana towns on the other side of the mountains. But it carried, I mean, I saw, this was when I witnessed it, months later, you could still see debris like 15, 20 miles downstream from some of the damage as the floods came through Gardner. And even in, was it October? So a few months later, I was able to walk up the road from the entrance towards where the first washout was. And it was this small river. I think it's called the Gardner River, that has a number of S curves through this almost a small gorge, if you want to call it that, pretty steep V embankment. But you could still see how high up this sloshing water hit as it went back and forth through these channels. It was pretty impressive to think about how much water, how much force. And then I came to where the first washout of the road had been. And again, it's that idea of something being so overwhelmed and the force and violence involved that it's a decent analogy for the type of process involved that I experienced. Another natural analogy that I could talk about is that of an avalanche. Again, I live in Montana. We have our snowpack, and I know there's avalanche specialists in the area. Every now and then on the news, they'll interview one of the guys who works for one of the agencies around town, and they study the snowpack for all the folks who go into the backcountry and ski and that type of thing. But of course, with snowpack like that, here you start talking about layers and layers of snow as it builds up. And of course, what can happen is through snow melt or through some kind of triggering, something happens where one of those layers, or one or more of those layers, give way, and all the material on top begins sliding. And then, of course, it pulls more material in as it goes sliding. Again, not a bad analogy. In my case, it was a moral injury that was the whack that triggered some process. And I could describe it as, it wasn't my first description, but I could relate to, okay, something gave way, which released this structure of material and ended up, and people get overwhelmed by it. Of course, people can die in avalanche slides. But again, it goes to the violence involved of this type of process. Another one I thought of involves ice dams. Again, this concept of snow converting into water and melting. You know, rivers get frozen up in the spring, depending on how things thaw. You can end up with ice dams. And of course, then when it releases, again, you're in a flooding situation. An earthquake. I should have put earthquake closer to avalanche, because the thing about an avalanche, it goes to the layers of the psyche. You know, that if a higher up level gives way, less material moves. But if it's down lower, you could end up with quite a bit of material that is removed or moves in some way. Earthquake is the same thing, that you can end up with a strong seismic shift on the surface of the earth, but the real core of it is down in the depths somewhere, you know, these fault lines or what have you. And of course, sometimes you can get earthquakes down in the depths that don't affect major areas in the same way, you know, however that energy dissipates. But the concept of an earthquake, again, the idea of whether it's the tectonic plates shifting, moving, and in that sense, it could be moving ever so slightly, but it's a massive result. I like it. As I think about that, it reminds me of the quote by Gabor Mate, who's a retired physician in Vancouver, who did a lot of work with people traumatized, homeless people in Vancouver, a lot of which goes back to trauma. I mentioned it before because I know one of the comments, someone mentioned The Wisdom of Trauma, which is a documentary about his work. But a quote is, we bury our feelings, too bad we bury them alive. And so that kind of goes to the idea of something buried that shifts, and it can cause major disruption. And again, a lot of energy involved. Resulting from an earthquake, going back to water, you can talk about a tsunami. That out on the ocean, a tsunami, you can't, I mean, they can detect it, but like you visually can't see it generally, you know, because the wave, the tsunami wave might only be a few feet tall. But as it comes into shore, that's when the impact happens. And so you could say that the tsunami wave out in the subconscious or something, but as it approaches consciousness, could cause some damage. Some other natural disasters, I don't tend to use them as much, but you could talk about wildfires. You know, how did they start? How did they spread? The same concept, the idea of burning things down that no longer serve you. But of course, that's a painful process if you think in terms of the electrical impulses in the brain, and if you were able to feel them, which at times I was, that's pretty painful. Other ones, things like you could go with tornadoes or hurricanes. But again, for me, these are some of these natural type events that may be rare, but the violence and force involved are decent ways to draw connections between the experience, the violent experience of this type of mental breakdown, if you want to call it, whether you call it psychosis. Psychosis is a different one because you end up getting multiple definitions, but I can talk to it. I'll probably talk to it in another video. But however you want to talk about this, whatever. And again, the whole purpose of metaphors and analogies is to try and use something that's more concrete and relate it to something that's abstract as a way of gaining understanding, as a way of feeling what that impact might be. So these are a number of them. So if you know someone who is struggling, and who definitely is like, this isn't an illness, see what kind of metaphors they might come up with. And if they still struggle, say, hey, there's any number of people who recognize there's other metaphors and analogies that can be used. So again, I hope this type of information is helpful to you, and or at least of interest. And yeah, thanks for joining me today. And I keep forgetting. I mean to do this at the start, but if you like what I'm doing, share, like, subscribe. And of course, I'm not providing medical services here. I'm just trying to help share what my experience was so that other people can potentially learn or benefit from, frankly, the hell I've been through. So, hope you guys have a great day, and thanks for joining me. Take care.